The wagon rattled away down the frozen Kansas road, carrying the last of her husband's family back to their homestead. Lily Brennan stood in the snow with her 10-year-old daughter Rose, watching them disappear. The January wind cut through her thin shawl, but she stood straight. "We don't want you here anymore," her brother-in-law Jacob had said that morning, his wife Sarah nodding beside him. "You're not blood. With William gone, there's no reason for you to stay. We need the room for our own children." There had been no malice in his voice, just cold practicality. Since her husband William had died of fever 6 months ago, Lily had felt the shift, the subtle exclusion from decisions, the comments about how she did things differently, the hints that she should think about her own future elsewhere. This morning, those hints had become direct. They'd given her a small bag of supplies and driven her the 5 miles to the nearest crossroads before turning back. It was January 1887 in southeastern Kansas, and Lily stood at a literal crossroads with her daughter, facing an uncertain future. The sky was the color of old pewter, promising more snow. "Mama, what are we going to do?" Rose asked, her voice small but steady. She was a practical child, her mother's daughter, not given to tears when action was needed. Lily looked around at the rolling prairie, the scattered trees, the endless sky. She thought of the boarding houses in town that would want money she didn't have. She thought of charity that came with judgment and pity. And then she thought of something her father had told her years ago, when she was a girl in Nebraska. "When you've got nothing but land and determination," he'd said, "you can build yourself a dugout. It's not fancy, but it'll keep you warm and dry, and it's yours." "We're going to build a house," Lily said, making the decision as she spoke it. "A dugout house. I've seen them before back in Nebraska. We dig into a hillside, build up the front, and we'll have a home that no one can take from us." Rose's eyes widened. "We're going to build a house? Just us?" "Just us," Lily confirmed. "But first, we need to find the right spot." They walked south along the road, Lily carrying their small bag of supplies and Rose staying close beside her. The January wind cut across the prairie with nothing to stop it, and Lily pulled Rose closer for warmth. Her mind was already working through the practicalities even as they walked. She needed a south-facing hillside for warmth and light. She needed to be near water, a creek or stream. She needed trees for the front wall and roof structure. She needed earth that would be workable but stable. They'd been walking for perhaps an hour, maybe 2. Time became elastic when you were cold and uncertain, when Rose suddenly stopped, her mittened hand gripping her mother's arm. "Mama, look. Is that a dog?" Huddled against a fence post about 20 yards from the road was a medium-sized dog, its brown and white coat matted with dirt and burrs. As they approached carefully, the dog lifted its head, dark eyes and a thin face, ribs showing through its fur. It was shivering, clearly abandoned and half-starved. A piece of rope hung from its neck, frayed at the end where it had been cut or broken. The dog didn't run as they approached. It simply watched them with wary, hopeful eyes. "Someone left him here," Rose said softly, kneeling in the snow a few feet from the animal. "Look, Mama, the rope was cut. They tied him up and left him." Lily knelt beside her daughter. She knew what had happened. She'd seen it before. Hard times made people make hard choices. A family moving on, unable to feed a dog. A farmer reducing mouths to feed. The dog had been deliberately abandoned, tied to prevent it from following, left to hope for the mercy of strangers. The dog's situation was so like their own, cast aside because it was inconvenient, because there wasn't room, because kindness had limits that ended where practicality began, left to hope for someone who might care. Lily understood this fate completely because she was living a version of it herself. "We don't have food for ourselves," Lily said, speaking aloud the calculation she was making. "Taking in a dog means sharing what little we have." "But he'll die out here alone," Rose said, her voice small but firm. "Just like we might." Lily looked at her daughter, then at the dog. Rose was right, of course, and beyond the practicality, there was something else. This animal needed help, and she could give it. Some things were more important than calculation. "Come here, boy," Lily said softly, holding out her hand. The dog hesitated, then slowly crawled forward through the snow, its tail giving a tentative wag. Lily let it sniff her hand, then gently removed the rope from its neck. The dog pressed against her, seeking warmth and connection. "What should we name him?" Rose asked, already stroking the dog's matted fur. "Flint," Lily said, thinking of the hard stone that could create fire, that could spark life from nothing. "His name is Flint." The three of them continued down the road together, woman, child, and dog, moving slowly to accommodate their new companion's weakened state. Lily gave Flint half of their dried meat, watching him eat slowly. She couldn't afford the food, not really, but she couldn't afford not to give it either. By afternoon, they found what Lily had been looking for: a gentle, south-facing slope near a creek, protected from the north wind by a rise of land behind it. A small grove of cottonwood trees stood nearby. The hillside was perfect, not too steep, not too shallow, with soil that looked workable. "This is it," Lily announced. "This is where we'll build our home." The first challenge was tools, or rather, the complete lack of them. Lily had only a small knife from the supplies Jacob had given them, barely adequate for cutting bread, let alone digging a home from the earth. But she was resourceful by necessity, and the prairie provided if you knew where to look. She found a flat stone near the creek that could serve as a crude shovel when gripped properly. She broke a strong branch from a fallen cottonwood tree to use as a digging stick, sharpening the end by scraping it against a rock. She found another stone with a sharp edge that could serve as a primitive axe for cutting smaller roots and branches. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. Pioneers had built with less. "A dugout is like a cave we make ourselves," she explained to Rose as they stood looking at the hillside. Flint sitting between them, his tail wagging slightly. "We'll dig back into the slope about 12 feet, maybe 8 feet wide and 6 feet tall. The earth itself becomes 3 of our walls and the ceiling. Then we build just a front wall with logs and sod, make a roof the same way, and we have a house that's warm in winter and cool in summer. The earth keeps the temperature steady." Rose looked doubtful. "Can we really do that? Just the two of us?" "Just the two of us," Lily confirmed, reaching down to pat Flint's head. "Well, 3 of us now. Flint will keep us company and help keep us warm." Over the next days and weeks, Lily worked with an intensity born of desperation and determination. She marked out the dimensions on the hillside using sticks and careful pacing, creating a rectangle that would be their home. Then she began the brutal work of excavating. The first day, she barely made a dent. The earth was hard with cold and compacted from years of prairie growth. Her flat stone turned out to be softer than the earth it was meant to move, and it crumbled after just a few hours of use. She had to find another, and another after that. Her digging stick broke twice before she learned to choose harder wood and keep the point sharper. But slowly, inch by painful inch, the dugout began to take shape. Lily dug along the marked lines, removing earth in layers. She learned to read the soil as she went. The dark topsoil gave way to clay, which was actually easier to work when slightly moist. She dug during the day when the temperature rose above freezing, because frozen ground was impossible to penetrate with her crude tools. Her hands blistered within the first few days. The blisters broke and bled, making every grip on the tools agony. But she wrapped them in strips of cloth torn from the hem of her dress and kept digging. The physical pain was almost a relief. It gave her something to focus on besides the uncertainty of their future. Rose helped in every way she could, and her help was essential despite her small size. She carried away the dirt Lily excavated, hauling it in her skirt and in a basket she wove from willow branches. She piled the excavated earth to the sides and front of the dugout, creating earthen walls that would eventually help support the roof. She gathered dead wood for the small fire Lily built at the excavation site each morning to warm her hands between digging sessions. She collected stones from the creek for the fire pit they'd need inside. Young as she was, she understood with a clarity beyond her years that survival depended on this work. There was no room for complaint or childish reluctance. She worked until her own small hands were raw, then worked some more. Flint proved his worth in unexpected ways. He stayed close to the worksite, his presence a comfort during the long hours of labor. At night, he curled up between Lily and Rose, his body warmth making the difference between bearable cold and bone-chilling misery. He alerted them to approaching travelers on the road, giving them time to decide whether to seek help or stay hidden. And when Rose's spirits flagged during the hardest days, Flint would press his head into her lap, his simple devotion a reminder that they weren't alone. The dugout took shape over 3 weeks of relentless labor. Lily dug back into the hillside, creating a rectangular space approximately 12 feet deep, 8 feet wide, and 6 feet high at the front, sloping slightly lower at the back where the earth ceiling would be. The walls weren't perfectly smooth. There were bulges and irregularities where roots or rocks had required working around, but they were surprisingly straight. She'd learned to follow the natural layers of soil, which ran horizontal to the ground and helped create stable walls. The floor she stamped flat and hard, walking over every inch of it repeatedly until it was packed solid. At the back of the dugout, she dug a small depression that would serve as cold storage. The earth there would stay cool year-round. Near the front, she left space for their fire pit. At the front of the dugout, she left the opening where they'd build the wall and door. This opening faced south, just as she'd planned, so it would catch the maximum sunlight during the short winter days. For the front wall, Lily had to cut young cottonwood trees from the grove. With only her stone axe, this was grueling work. She chose trees about 4 inches in diameter, thick enough to be sturdy, thin enough to be manageable. She chipped away at each tree in a ring around the trunk, working for hours on each one until it weakened enough to push over. Then she trimmed the branches and dragged the logs to the site, sometimes with Samuel helping pull while Rose cleared the path of obstacles. She set the logs upright side by side across the front of the dugout, sinking their ends into the earth to anchor them. This created a wall about 6 feet high. The gaps between logs she filled with a mixture of mud and dried grass, primitive chinking that she made by mixing clay from the creek with water and dried prairie grass chopped fine. The mud would freeze solid in winter, she knew, creating an effective seal against the wind. She left one section of the front wall open for a door, which she created from woven branches lashed together with strips of hide she'd traded for with a passing farmer. The farmer had stopped to water his horse at the creek, seen their work, and offered the hide in exchange for Lily spending half a day mending a tear in his wagon's canvas cover. The door wasn't beautiful, but it could be opened and closed, and it would keep out most of the weather. The roof was perhaps the greatest challenge of all. Lily had never built a roof before, had only seen them on other dugouts years ago in Nebraska. She laid cottonwood poles across the top of the dugout, spanning from the front wall back to rest on the earthen ceiling at the rear. Each pole had to be stripped of branches, cut to the right length, and positioned carefully. She used more than 20 poles, laying them close together. The roof was perhaps the greatest challenge of all. Lily had never built a roof before, had only seen them on other dugouts years ago in Nebraska, when her father had pointed them out during a wagon journey. She laid cottonwood poles across the top of the dugout, spanning from the front wall, back to rest on the earthen ceiling at the rear. Each pole had to be stripped of branches, cut to the right length with her stone axe, a process that took hours per pole, and positioned carefully so it would bear weight evenly. She used more than 20 poles, laying them close together with barely an inch between them. Over these poles, she laid smaller branches crosswise, creating a lattice. This took days, finding suitable branches, stripping them, laying them in a pattern that would support the next layer. Rose and Samuel helped gather branches. Then came layers of prairie grass. Lily and the children spent 2 days cutting dried grass from the prairie, gathering it in great armloads and spreading it thick over the branch lattice, layering it so water would run off. Finally came the sod, chunks of earth held together by grass roots that Lily cut from the prairie. Each piece was heavy, roughly the size of a brick. She and the children worked together to carry them to the roof. Lily laid them grass side down over the grass layer, fitting them together like pieces of a puzzle. The sod formed a living roof that would shed rain and hold heat. She left a small opening near the front for smoke from their fire. The door she created from willow branches woven together, covered with canvas she'd found on a fence post. It wasn't beautiful, but it would keep out the weather. 4 weeks after they'd started, the dugout was complete enough to move into. It wasn't finished. There were gaps to fill, improvements to make, details to refine. But it was habitable, it was weatherproof, and it was theirs. The interior was dim, lit only by what light came through the doorway and the smoke hole. But Lily's eyes adjusted quickly. The space was snug, perhaps 12 feet deep and 8 feet wide, with a ceiling that was barely 6 feet high at the front, sloping down at the back. But it was surprisingly warm. Lily created a fire pit in the center of the floor, lined with flat stones from the creek. The smoke rose naturally to the hole in the roof. Around the edges of the space, she built sleeping platforms from stacked sod bricks, raising them 6 inches off the cold ground. She covered them with layers of dried grass for cushioning. She created storage at the back of the dugout, adding shelves made from flat stones balanced on stacked rocks. Every item had its place. Rose made hooks from bent branches that Lily attached to the front wall for hanging things. Together, they created a simple broom from bundled prairie grass tied to a stick. Rose organized their possessions, creating order from very little. She designated areas for different purposes and made mats from woven grass to place at the entrance. She even created a special sleeping spot for Flint near the fire, padding it with extra grass so he'd be comfortable. "It's like being inside the earth," Rose said, not with fear but with wonder. Flint circled the space, sniffing every corner before settling near the fire with a contented sigh. "That's exactly what it is," Lily agreed, "and the earth will keep us warm." She was right. The dugout maintained a remarkably stable temperature. The earth walls absorbed heat from their small fire during the day and released it slowly through the cold nights. Even when January storms howled across the prairie above, inside the dugout, the temperature remained bearable. And with Flint's warm body pressed against them at night, they slept better than they had since leaving their former home. Food was the constant challenge that haunted their days, more pressing even than the cold. Lily set snares for rabbits using wire she'd salvaged from an abandoned fence she'd found half buried in snow about 2 miles from their dugout. She showed Rose how to identify the signs of rabbit runs in the snow, the small tracks, the tunnels through deeper drifts, the scattered droppings that indicated regular paths. Flint proved to be a skilled hunter once his strength returned. He would range out from the dugout each morning, his nose to the ground, and more than once he returned with a rabbit in his jaws, laying it at Lily's feet with evident pride. These catches supplemented their snares, and Lily always made sure Flint got his share of the meat he'd earned. The rabbits they caught were small, lean from winter, but everyone was precious. Lily used every part of each animal with the efficiency of someone who understood that waste meant death. The meat they ate immediately or dried over their fire for later. The pelts she cleaned and dried, eventually stitching them together to create an additional blanket that smelled wild but held heat remarkably well. The bones she roasted and then crushed, mixing the bone meal with water to create a nutritious, if unappetizing, broth. Even the organs, which might have been discarded in better times, they ate, saving choice pieces for Flint as reward for his hunting. They supplemented the rabbits with whatever else they could find. Lily dug for roots using her digging stick, Jerusalem artichokes and wild onions. She collected rose hips from wild bushes, knowing from her mother that these would help prevent scurvy. She showed Rose how to identify winter-dormant plants that would be edible come spring. A traveling peddler who stopped to water his horse took pity on them and gave them a small bag of cornmeal in exchange for Lily mending a tear in his coat. That cornmeal, carefully rationed, made the difference between genuine hunger and starvation during some of the hardest weeks. Rose thrived in ways that surprised Lily. Her daughter took to the life with enthusiasm, learning everything her mother could teach. She became expert at tending the fire, at stretching their meager food supplies, at reading the weather by watching the sky. She learned to identify edible plants, to set snares, to work the earth. The frightened child, who had stood in the snow outside her uncle's house, was transforming into a capable young woman. Flint, too, recovered his strength and spirit. His ribs no longer showed through his coat, which Rose brushed regularly with a handful of dried grass until it shone. He filled out, becoming muscular and healthy. His hunting skills kept them fed many days, and his warmth kept them alive many nights. But more than that, his loyalty and affection gave them something precious, the feeling that they were a complete family, not just survivors, but a unit bound by love and mutual dependence. Lily taught Rose to read and write, using a charred stick and the smooth side of pieces of bark. They practiced their letters by the firelight in the evenings. The two of them huddled together with Flint stretched out beside them, his head resting on Rose's lap. "Why did you take Flint in?" Rose asked one evening, stroking the dog's fur as she practiced her letters. "We had so little already. We could barely feed ourselves." Lily looked at her daughter, then at the dog sleeping peacefully between them. "Because I know what it's like to be cast aside, because he needed help, and I could give it, because having him here reminds us that we're still capable of kindness, even when things are hard. That matters, Rose. That might matter most of all." As winter deepened, they established routines that made life bearable. Morning meant banking the fire and checking what weather awaited them above ground. If conditions allowed, they checked the snares, let Flint out to hunt, and gathered what fuel they could find: dried buffalo chips, dead wood, anything that would burn. Afternoon meant preparing food, making repairs to the dugout, working on improvements. Evening meant lessons for Rose, stories, and the simple companionship of a mother, daughter, and loyal dog who had found family in each other. The dugout evolved with their needs. Lily created a small storage pit in one corner, dug deeper into the earth where the cool temperature would preserve what little food they had. Samuel built a shelf system from stacked flat stones and pieces of wood, giving them places to keep their possessions organized. Rose made crude candles from animal fat and strips of cloth, giving them light beyond the fire. The hardest times came during the worst of the winter storms, when they couldn't leave the dugout for days at a time. The small space could feel suffocating, the darkness oppressive. But Lily kept them busy, teaching Rose, telling stories, planning for spring. And Flint's presence helped immeasurably. His steady breathing, his warm body, his simple contentment with being near them. These things reminded them that life continued, that warmth and connection existed even in the darkest days. When the weather warms, she told Rose, we'll plant a garden right outside our door. We'll grow beans and squash and corn. We'll have a real harvest come fall. And I'll help Flint hunt, Rose added, stroking the dog's ears. Between the garden and the hunting, we'll have plenty. We'll make this a real home, Lily promised. Better than the one we left behind. February brought signs of coming change. The sun rose earlier, set later. The worst of the cold began to ease, though winter was far from over. Lily ventured further from the dugout, exploring their territory. She discovered wild plum trees that would fruit in summer. She found clay near the creek that could be used for making pots. She identified good locations for expanding their garden. Each discovery was a piece of their future, a promise that survival would become something more. One afternoon in late February, a neighboring homesteader stopped at their dugout. He'd heard rumors of a woman and child living in a hillside and had come to see if it was true. Flint's bark announced his arrival before Lily saw him. "This is remarkable," he said, examining their home with genuine respect, while Flint sniffed his boots suspiciously. "You built this yourself?" "With my daughter," Lily said, pulling Rose close. "We built it together." The man, whose name was Martin Fletcher, shook his head in admiration. "I've seen grown men with teams of oxen struggle to build a decent dugout. You've done this with nothing but your own hands." He reached into his wagon. "I've got some seed potatoes I can spare. Plant these come spring, and you'll have food for next winter. And here," he pulled out a large bone, "for your dog. He looks like a good hunter." Flint accepted the bone with dignity, carrying it to his spot by the fire. Martin became their first friend, stopping by every few weeks to check on them, always finding some excuse to leave behind something useful. A metal pot, some flour, a hammer, scraps of fabric for Rose. As March arrived and winter began to truly loosen its grip, Lily stood outside their dugout one evening with Rose beside her and Flint at their feet. The sun was setting, painting the Kansas sky in shades of orange and pink. Smoke from their fire drifted up from the earth, marking their home. "We did it," Rose said softly. "We survived the winter." "We did more than survive," Lily corrected, reaching down to scratch Flint's ears. "We built a home. We built a family." Rose looked up at her mother. "Are we really a family? Just the two of us and Flint?" Lily pulled her daughter close, and Flint pressed against their legs. "Family isn't just blood relations or big numbers. Family is who you choose to stand beside, who you build your life with, who keeps you warm through the winter. We're a family." The dugout behind them was humble, just a hole in a hillside with a roof of sod and grass. but it represented something far greater than its simple construction suggested. It was proof that determination could overcome circumstance. It was evidence that kindness, even the kindness of taking in a starving dog, multiplied rather than diminished when shared. It was a home built not from lumber and nails, but from necessity, compassion, and the fierce will to survive. As spring came fully, they would plant their garden. They would improve their home. They would build on what they'd created through the hardest winter of their lives. But the essential work was already done. They had survived, yes, but more than that. They had built something that would last, a family, a home, and the knowledge that together, woman, child, and faithful dog, they could weather any storm. The earthen home would stand for years, eventually becoming legendary in the area, the place where a woman and her daughter had carved out a life from nothing but a hillside and determination. Other families facing hard times would look to it as proof that survival was possible, that home wasn't something you had to be given, but something you could build with your own hands. And inside that dugout, as spring brought new life to the prairie, 2 people and 1 devoted dog who had all been cast aside by circumstance found warmth, safety, and belonging in each other, and in the home they'd built together from the earth itself.